Thank you so much, and thank you for your graciousness in hosting us here tonight and all the great work you do in the community. It's wonderful to have partners like this in our ongoing efforts. I'm Andrew Berman, Executive Director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, and for those of you, if there are any of you who aren't familiar with who we are, we're a membership-based organization founded in 1980, and our mission is to educate about, celebrate, and protect the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. And specifically tonight, this is our first program, actually our kickoff in a year-long series of programming that we're going to be doing celebrating the 50th anniversary of the designation of the Greenwich Village Historic District, which was designated in April of 1969. It's one of many wonderful 50th anniversaries that are happening this year that we're going to be celebrating. The Greenwich Village Historic District is, of course, near and dear to our hearts. In fact, when GVHD50 was founded, its primary mission originally was to be a sort of a caretaker and a watchdog for the Greenwich Village Historic District. Our mission, that's still a central part of our mission, but our responsibilities have expanded since then, both geographically and in terms of the types of work that we do, in terms of cultural preservation, small business, theaters, the arts, etc. But in addition to its centrality to our mission, the designation of the Greenwich Village Historic District was really a momentous time in the preservation movement in New York City. It really was a watershed designation. It was the largest historic district designated for many years, and depending on how you measure it, it still is. There's a bit of a debate between Greenwich Village and Park Slope about which district is bigger, and it kind of depends on how you measure it. But it also clearly was an incredibly important moment for Greenwich Village in terms of efforts to ensure the preservation of this historic neighborhood, which is constantly under threat and pressure in terms of change. Some of that change is good, some of that change is not so good, and certainly the historic district is designed to try to hold on to certainly some aspects of the neighborhood that many people feel are very important. So before I get to my presentation, I want to introduce the three panelists who are going to be speaking also tonight following me. And the first one on my farthest left is Mosette Broderick. Mosette is a clinical professor of art history at New York University. She conducts research in 19th and 20th century architecture and urbanism in America and England, 19th century social history, collecting history, and Fifth Avenue. She's involved with NYU's MA program on adaptive reuse and sustainable practices at their campus in London, and is currently writing a volume on Fifth Avenue from Washington Square to 93rd Street. That covers a lot of territory. Next to Mosette is Frances Maroney, who is an architectural historian and writer, the author of 11 books. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Landmarks Lion of the Historic Districts Council. He's also the author of GVHD50's newly released report, A History of the East Village and Its Architecture, of which we are incredibly proud. And if you haven't seen it, although I see a lot of heads nodding, so clearly a lot of you have, it's on our website. Just go to gvshp.org/Maroney, and that'll take you right to it. And then last but certainly not least, we have Susan DeVries, who's a researcher, writer, and photographer of Brooklyn's architectural heritage for brownstoner.com and a preservation consultant in New York City. Active in the preservation field for over 2 decades, she's previously worked for the New York Department of Parks and Recreation and held roles at the National Trust for Historic Preservation and at GVHD50. She currently serves on the board of the New York Preservation Archive Project, an organization dedicated to documenting, preserving, and celebrating the history of historic preservation in New York City. And actually, an extra plug for NIPAP, you'll see actually a bit of their resources in my presentation tonight. They're really a wonderful organization. So each of the panelists are going to give a brief presentation, about 10 minutes-ish, more or less. Then we'll have a little bit of a moderated discussion, and then it's time for some Q&A from the audience. And again, this is the first in a series of programming that we're going to be doing about the 50th anniversary of the Historic District. So if you don't get your entire 50th anniversary fix tonight, don't worry about it. There'll be plenty more opportunities, including our kind of marquee event, which is going to be in April when the actual anniversary takes place, when we're going to do a big celebration in Washington Square, along with a district-wide open house. Several dozen institutions, businesses, houses of worship in the district are going to join with us in opening their doors for the weekend of April 13th, and welcome the public in to kind of take in and celebrate all of the many things that help make the Greenwich Village Historic District such a spectacular and wonderful place. So we're really looking forward to that. So let me, from here, move to my presentation. And my goal tonight, and it's really impossible to do the story of the designation of the Greenwich Village Historic District justice with one or even four presentations, but we're each going to try to kind of hit it from our own little angle. Mine, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a setup in terms of what happened immediately going into the designation, and then take a look at the actual designation and what its intended effect was according to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and then we'll hear from other folks. So first of all, just to give a little bit of quick context, it wasn't until 1956 that the Bard Act was passed in New York, which was an act of the state legislature which gave municipalities like New York City the ability to pass landmarks preservation laws. So prior to that, it wasn't even really a possibility in New York City to do that, though certainly there was agitation for preservation and for preservation legislation prior to that time. There are many, many battles that were going on in Greenwich Village long before the battle for the designation of the Greenwich Village Historic District, but a couple of the ones that immediately preceded it and that took place in what eventually became the Greenwich Village Historic District were, for instance, the fight to both get cars out of Washington Square and to ensure that Robert Moses's highway did not run through Washington Square. For those of you who are too young to remember or who maybe forgot, cars used to go through Washington Square, but that wasn't enough for Robert Moses. He thought it would make a great on-ramp to the new Lower Manhattan Expressway, and that's what he intended to do. And the great compromise that the city was seeking to broker between the neighborhood and Robert Moses was to say, well, we'll run the highway through the park, but we'll create a pedestrian overpass over it so that the two sides of the park could still be accessed by people, not just cars. Fortunately, that was not successful. There was definitely a very vigorous effort to save the square, which was meant sort of a little bit ironically in that kind of beatniky sort of font that they were using there, and this was in the late 1950s. And here you can see is the last car through Washington Square in 1958, when activists from the neighborhood were able to get cars temporarily banned at first. It was then made permanent, and then of course the Lower Manhattan Expressway was killed. That's a whole other program and story unto itself. Another one of the efforts that preceded the designation of the Greenwich Village Historic District in 1969, which was very important, was the rezoning of the neighborhood in 1961, and the group Save the Village was very actively involved in the effort around rezoning. And here is a very difficult to read, but it is what it is, zoning map of the village in 1961. It doesn't look that different now, but highlighted in red are all the areas that say R6. R6 was a special type of zoning that folks from the village fought very hard for, that was intended to preserve row houses. It had its limitations. These days, in fact, if we have our druthers, we actually try to get rid of R6 for more contextual zoning, which didn't even exist at the time. But in terms of the tools that were available then, zoning-wise, it was the best thing going. And they did manage to get R6 designations on many blocks of the village, and that was a really important victory, and this was in 1961. Now, zoning is not the same thing as landmarking. It doesn't preserve architectural detail. It doesn't say this can't be torn down. It only says certain broad brushstroke things about the size of what can be built in certain locations. So it was a step forward, but it was certainly not the fulfillment of the preservation dream for the neighborhood. And then just very briefly, this here is Margot Gale with the Jefferson Market Library. In the early 1960s, there was, of course, the fight to save the library, to turn it into to save the courthouse and to turn it into a library. And Margot was, of course, one of the key players in that. And this was one of the early sort of battles to save what was considered a local landmark and to see it adaptively reused. So in 1962, the Landmarks Preservation Commission is actually officially constituted. Now, it didn't yet at this point have the power to designate landmarks, but it was made an entity. There were members appointed to it, and of course, this was right in the middle of the battle over Penn Station, which of course was not saved. In 1963, demolition began after the Landmarks Preservation Commission was constituted, but before it actually had the power to save buildings. So not long after the Landmarks Preservation Commission was constituted, Jane Jacobs, who was of course one of the many but main activists in the neighborhood pushing for designation of a Greenwich Village Historic District, because they all anticipated that the commission would be getting that power. She wrote this letter to the then chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission and highlighted, you can see, she said, "We urge that the proposed historic area include all of western Greenwich Village. That is, that the western boundary be drawn not short of West Street." As many of you know, that did not end up being the case in spite of the best efforts of Jane Jacobs and many others, but that was definitely a big part of what was going on at the time. Another area that folks were really focused on trying to get included in the Greenwich Village Historic District that they were ultimately not successful with then is what we refer to as the South Village, the area south of Washington Square and what eventually became the Greenwich Village Historic District, which was kind of the heart of the old Italian immigrant part of Greenwich Village, which was just deemed not as worthy of preservation at the time. And we've actually gone through the files that both the Landmarks Preservation Commission and local activists had, showing the work that they did to try to document the buildings in there, which were, for the most part, not designated. Finally, there were folks, and if you go to our website and you look at our Preservation Pioneers oral histories, we have some oral histories with Jane Jacobs and Shirley Hayes and Ruth Wittenberg and other folks. A lot of them talk about how there was a push to just get the entirety of Community Board 2 as one big historic district. So that would have been Greenwich Village, the West Village, Soho, Little Italy, what's now called NoHo, even Hudson Square. That was, of course, not what would be. But in 1965, the New York City Landmarks Law was enacted by Mayor Wagner, and finally the commission had the power to actually start doing designations, and shortly thereafter they did start holding hearings on districts. And certainly Greenwich Village and activists from Greenwich Village were at the head of the line, along with other folks, in terms of pushing for designation of a Greenwich Village Historic District, but it actually took quite a bit of time to get that done. And I want to show you all of the districts that were designated before the Greenwich Village Historic District. And not to say that these were easy, because some of them certainly had considerable hurdles as well. But the Greenwich Village Historic District faced some particular obstacles. So the very first district designated in 1965 was the Brooklyn Heights Historic District, which was a real neighborhood-wide district. What I believe made Brooklyn Heights a little bit easier was it had these already defined boundaries on at least 3 of the 4 sides that were sort of very clear. Beyond Brooklyn Heights, it was mostly these little districts that were kind of both sides of one street, or maybe one side of one street, and that was it. Next came Sniffen Court. I don't know if you know it, just off of 36th Street in East Midtown. It's this charming little courtyard of converted stables. Turtle Bay Gardens, which is just sort of the middle of a block in East Midtown here with a shared backyard. Charlton King Van Dam, a little bit bigger, but again, a very sort of small, distinct area, which is what the commission was really more focused on in those early days. Just these little places that were cut seemingly entirely of the same cloth, or at least very close to it. You have the Gramercy Park Historic District. So again, something that was kind of centered around a park or some sort of central space was what they often looked for. Whoops. This historic district up here in Harlem, it's called the St. Nicholas Historic District, but it's really known more commonly as Stryver's Row. And it's really both sides of two streets, 138th and 139th, with these back alleyways between it. So again, this very, very distinctive, discrete space. McDougal Sullivan Gardens, so this was the first district designated in the village, but certainly very limited in size. It's houses on McDougal and Sullivan Street, just in the center of that block. And then the Treadwell Farm Historic District on the Upper East Side on 61st and 62nd Street. Then finally Hunters Point in Queens, both sides of this street, and St. Mark's just nearby in the East Village, largely revolving around Renwick Triangle and St. Mark's Church. So there was definitely movement on a lot of other stuff before the commission finally got to the Greenwich Village Historic District. This is what was first put forward by the LPC. As you can see, extensive, but without the waterfront stuff. West Street is over here, without any of the sort of the stuff in the South Village. Those were all originally left out. And this is interesting, what it says in the designation report. It says that on December 9th, 1965, the Commission held a public hearing on the proposed designation of the Greenwich Village Historic District. 41 people spoke in favor, 23 opposed it. The Commission received dozens of letters in support of the designation. Communications indicated there was substantial backing from the designation from many residents of the village, including a large number of homeowners. Not a big surprise. The Commission held additional public hearings on December 21st, 1966, in 1967, on February 7th, and February 28th. At the public hearings, the Commission also had before it an alternative proposal to create 18 historic districts within the boundaries of the originally proposed Greenwich Village Historic District. At the three additional public hearings, the great majority of the testimony favored the designation of Greenwich Village as a single historic district. At the time, the Commission also received a large number of letters and telegrams favoring the designation as a single historic district. So this is the infamous 18 mini-districts, all lying within what eventually became and what was originally proposed as the district. And basically what you can see is they cut out any major street, anywhere where they felt that there was sort of altered fabric. It's really almost exclusively the row house streets, but none of the other wonderful architecture that makes up the fabric of Greenwich Village. And this is what was eventually designated on April 29th, 1969. The district that we have today, which remained like this for almost 40 years until there were the first extensions to it that were designated. And what I'd like to do is actually read from the designation report to kind of give you a sense of what the Commission was saying about this place at the time and what the intention was. So, of the historic districts, now this is the Landmarks Preservation Commission speaking in the designation report. Of the historic districts in New York City which have been designated or will be designated, Greenwich Village outranks all others. This supremacy comes from the quality of its architecture, the nature of the artistic life within its boundaries, and the feeling of history that permeates its streets. The eastern part of Greenwich Village has the open sweep of Washington Square and the splendid vista of Fifth Avenue, with the fine houses adjoining it on either side, while the western part has other fine buildings, roadways with unexpected changes in direction, like here on Commerce Street, and glimpses of quaint little streets, such as Grove Court. The village means something real, tangible, and livable to its inhabitants, while to the casual visitor it represents a chance to look into the world of hidden charm, mystery, and ever-changing vistas. What is exceptional about Greenwich Village is its many tree-lined streets, the human scale of so many of its buildings, and the special architectural qualities of its houses. Because of the nature of its development, there are many homogeneous rows of houses built by investors, designed in the most attractive styles of the periods in which they were constructed. They include fine federal houses with gabled roofs and dormers, Flemish bond brickwork, and exceptionally attractive wrought ironwork. At the next stage of development, the Greek Revival introduced greater height featuring attic windows, rusticated stone basements, splendid doorways, and wrought ironwork embellished with castings utilizing Greek detail. Next came the Romantic styles, of which the Italianate was predominant. It introduced the New York brownstone as we know it today. These stately, dignified houses, later modified by French influence, were built among the houses of earlier periods, lending great variety and interest. The exceptionally fine quality of village architecture, together with its special quaintness, are found nowhere else in New York. While architectural quality is in evidence everywhere, it is especially prominent in streets such as Washington Square North, with its long row of Greek Revival houses, and 10th and 11th Streets west of 5th Avenue. Here, an interesting blending of styles sets off terraces of Anglo-Italianate houses. Quaintness is especially to be seen in such small streets as Washington Mews, McDougal Alley, and Gay Street. Here, with diminutive houses converted from stables in the mews in the alley, and with the fine small houses of artisans and tradesmen in Gay Street, we sense the continuity of life in a given locale, but little changed from the days when they were built. Picturesqueness is evident especially at the corner of 6th Avenue and West 10th Street in the silhouette of the old Jefferson Market Courthouse, with its multicolored Victorian detail recently converted to use as a library. Terminal features so rare at the end of our streets in this city are found both at the arch on Washington Square, which closes the end of 5th Avenue, and the western end of Grove Street, where one comes upon charming little St. Luke's Chapel. With the exception of Washington Square, squares in the village are mostly triangular in shape and small. These include Village, Abingdon, and Jackson Squares, as well as Sheridan Square with its adjoining little park, all formed by the intersection of 2 or more streets. They are open features of this area which increase its attractiveness to many families. One of the most notable and unusual features to be found only in Greenwich Village is the array of handsome studios for artists. These studios scattered at random throughout the area generally display a large studio window at the top floor, often tastefully introduced above the cornice line. Also characteristic of Greenwich Village, and in a sense unique to the area, is an almost bizarre type of small town house, unusual in its architecture, colors, and materials. These houses, no two alike, are to be found in the most unexpected places and are usually the result of subsequent remodelings or the application of the talent of village artists to its exteriors. Although not numerous, the exceptionally fine churches within the district lend an air of great distinction. They range in style from Federal to Gothic Revival and include several of the finest Greek Revival churches in the city. The 2 splendid Gothic Revival churches on the west side of 5th Avenue have notable towers and some of the finest detail of their period. I'm just going to wrap up with a statement here from the Greenwich Village Historic District designation report. It says, one of the worst dangers in the village has been the defacement of houses by renovations which are often incompatible with the surrounding architecture. For many years, community organizations have, by means of volunteer workers, fought to secure protection for the neighborhood as a whole. The property owners and other residents have always strongly supported a program of designation and preservation. Their familiarity with preservation programs being carried on in other cities has led to the drive to obtain municipal protections for their outstanding area. The overriding consideration in creating an historic district is the protection of an entire outstanding area, and only the creation of a historic district can halt the piecemeal destruction of such a fine area. From the totality of Greenwich Village emanates an appearance and even more a spirit and character of old New York, which no single block thereof and no individual landmark could possibly provide. It is this collective emanation which distinguishes an historic district, and particularly Greenwich Village, from a landmark and gives it unique aesthetic and historical value. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about how New York City would have looked in the period before this became the first large-scale historic district. In the early days of the 20th century, New York had left this area far behind. An area that had once been a vacation area, a summer place of sanctity and safe health from yellow fever and cholera epidemics. It had become a working class district and had been kind of forgotten about by the people who fled uptown. sorry, New York was a weird place. Every generation, the city moved 20 blocks higher. It seemed in the 19th century that one block was developed, followed to the north, every single year. So by the time we come along to the 1920s, we're looking at New York City inhabitants who maybe now 3 generations into moving uptown. And they're going to do something very dramatic, and that is going into apartments. It's the one I'm thinking. So at this point, people are leaving behind their row houses, and they're going to a slender corridor of habitation between between Grand Central Station's tracks and Fifth Avenue, and they're moving into apartment houses built by people like Cross and Cross and so many others, the apartments that we now look on as vintage, wonderful apartments in New York City. The Upper East Side is where the important people, the powerful people lived. Over across the street, there was another area developing, and that is the Upper West Side, particularly the area along Central Park West. But that wasn't quite the powerhouse that the Upper East Side was. The West Side consisted of professionals and large numbers of people who were now part of the thriving world of clothing manufacture, the garment makers who made New York famous in the first half of the 20th century. So we've got the Upper West, the Upper East, and anybody else was probably over the East River like Lucy and Desi. When we look at where they lived at the 640 East 64th Street or wherever it is, there in the East River. So this is the area that counts. And we know this because the IRT system stuck a line right up the east side, the upper half above Grand Central Station, making a now easy, today overcrowded, method of getting to Lexington Avenue and 86th Street, of getting up to the Park Avenue area. In the 1920s, the power still was in these people's hands, although nobody was living in New York quite as much as we thought. Many of these people also had houses in Greenwich, on the North Shore of Long Island, maybe removing themselves just a little bit from the growth of New York. In the 1930s, it all stopped. Very little was built except for endless numbers of rather good post offices, now an endangered species, and then an apartment house on 240 Central Park South, which was built just at the end of the Great Depression. But basically, the apartment buildings were going downhill. They had no maintenance. Nobody was putting any money into them. And by the time the war ended, we had a real problem. We had groups of young men coming back from the war, wanting desperately to forget the war, and wanting to find a place to live, and they discovered something called rent control. Many New York City big apartments were in the hands of a single lady who might rent out rooms, but this was certainly not where a family could be started. And so, in the years just after the war, Mr. Levitt brilliantly and other people made a suburbanization, and that moved a lot of people out of Manhattan. There was another battle going on at the time, and that battle was the new financial capital going to be only at Wall Street, only at Midtown, or both? What was going to happen? Just as the stock market crashed, the Shannon Building had been built on 42nd Street, just across from the Chrysler Building, which was standing there. And so the question was, is Wall Street going to continue? Or is it going to be Midtown? Or is it going to be anything? New York looked grim. And the lifeblood came in with the United Nations. In the late 1940s, the UN, on too small a piece of land, in a very long, complicated story with Mr. Zeckendorf and Mr. Rockefeller, came up with an idea that the world's problems could be solved by a body that would debate the issues in the East 40s. And that was the B-12 that brought back New York, and it was Midtown. So what do we do? Well, David Rockefeller got into the act, and David Rockefeller said, wait a second, we can't let lower than half prices fall. So David Rockefeller gave us a wonderful picture pictures, and it doesn't look at all like it. This is Chase Manhattan Plaza of 1958, which gives a commercial roll back to Lower Manhattan. So the battle between Lower Manhattan and Midtown raged on. But the first building built after the war by a commercial enterprise was the Saucony Motor Oil building here, that wonderful building on 42nd Street on Gillette Land. You all probably know the building. I always thought it was aluminum, but it turns out those are steel plates. All right, now, thank you. And then in comes the New World, and the New World is up there. The New World is at Midtown, and in comes Lehman Brothers, Seagram's, and for residents, no more cross. This is Manhattan House. This is an attempt by the upper class who are selling off their row houses, or grandma had died and they got their row houses on Carnegie Hill, to move into a fellow building filled with people like us. And so Skid Maloney's and Merrill's wonderful 66th Street Manhattan House brought the upper class who are still in New York into a modern building. All of this left out Greenwich Village. None of these people and none of the pressure on real estate came here. The pressure on real estate was on those streets where they were tearing down the L and opening up the light on those streets and giving us those white tile buildings that tried to complete the image of Manhattan House on the cheap. The white tile buildings we know on 2nd, 3rd, 1st Avenues, and a few other buildings like down here, Stewart House, which was built on the ruins of the fire there. So we see real estate pressure, but it isn't here. This is a beautiful area. It's a derelict area. The artists were leaving. The owners of the galleries were moving in. The musicians were leaving. The owners of the record labels were coming in. There was money coming in here, and money could refresh the tired buildings. And then there was the fervor that Mr. Urban just spoke about with the saving of the clock as the vital effort to save Jefferson Market Courthouse Complex. We lost the jail. Some of you may remember the jail and the Sutters across the street. The effort here was Marco Gale, Brendan Gill, and Henry Russell Hitchcock trying desperately to fix that clock because they figured if they could get the clock going, people would pay attention to the issue, and they did. And so there was preservation in the air here, and it is at this moment that the real estate community kind of said, well, you know, we're not going to lose anything here, we're not building here. And the Landmark Commission would have said, we want a win-win. We want to build a historic district that nobody's going to take to court, that nobody's going to complain about, and where the economics are safe. You're not doing this to some poor community that can't afford to fix the buildings up anymore. You're doing it to people who want to gentrify the village. And this all comes about at a time when we ruined the slightly eastern portion of the village. What we're looking at here is Bleecker Street going east, an area that had been Stanford White's family's, or the Stewart family's, real estate invention. And what we had down here was something like 70,000 light manufacturing jobs, which supported large numbers of lower middle class workers who worked in these old buildings doing old manufacturing in the 1950s. That all went down. Urban renewal came in and sat there. Nobody knew what to do with it. Indeed, the area that is today the pretty hideous Bose Library was actually offered up as a place for the Metropolitan Opera to build. They were searching always until the Lincoln Center. They were offered the chance to build an opera house right there in 1955. They didn't. We all know this ends up being silver towers, etc. But from what I gather, a lot of working people were thrown out and these buildings were torn down. So they had that happening close by here too. So saving this area is obviously an important part of making Greenwich Village one of the first big historic districts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Moshe. And now we're going to hear from Francis Maroney.
Can you all hear me okay? I just want okay, here we are. I just want to talk a little bit about what led to sort of the concern for preservation in Greenwich Village, what we could call the preservation movement in Greenwich Village. And I want to focus on a little stretch of Washington Square North. which is very familiar to everybody. The great row of Greek Revival houses from numbers 1 to 13, Washington Square North between University Place and Fifth Avenue, are very well known, not just to all New Yorkers, but to so many non-New Yorkers. And it may seem to you that it was somehow foreordained that those houses would always survive, that they would be with us always, and yet nothing could be further from the truth. As I think many of you in this audience know, the land was owned by an organization called Sailors Snug Harbor. And they let the land on long leases that reverted to the developers of these houses. And those leases reverted to Sailors Snug Harbor in the 1930s, which gave Sailors Snug Harbor the opportunity to demolish whatever they wished to demolish and redevelop it with perhaps big apartment houses, which would be more profitable for them. Thank goodness it was the 1930s. Nothing was easily done in the 1930s. Henry Hope Reed used to say that the architectural historian's best friend is an economic downturn. And this has proven to be the case in New York time and again, as we shall also see a little bit later. But the very real possibility existed that those houses would be torn down. They weren't, and I don't want to get into the details of how that row was saved, because what I really want to talk about is what was going on the other side of Fifth Avenue, on Washington Square North. Suffice it to say, oh, by the way, number 7, Washington Square North, right there, that was the DeForest House, the home of Robert W. DeForest, who was the president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That's the house that was very briefly lived in, only for a few months, by Edith Wharton and her mother in 1882. This is what 11, 12, and 13 Washington Square North looked like originally. When the land was leased to a group of developers who put up these houses in 1832-33, this is what they looked like. And you may be thinking to yourself, that's what they still look like. But if you look very closely, you'll see that, in fact, there are some subtle differences between the way those houses originally looked and the way they look today. For instance, you see up here, there is a rooftop balustrade. It's not there anymore. This is what the houses, well, we see just another picture of them, but this is after 1 Fifth Avenue's gone up. This is what they look like today. You'll notice that the tops of the houses are different. The tops were altered, and this is how those houses were saved. Sailors Snug Harbor, in flusher economic times, may very well have raised those houses, but given the economic reality of the situation, they were convinced. We're told that the Municipal Art Society had a lot to do with this. They were talked into preserving the houses by gutting the interiors and transforming the houses into apartments, not a series of individual apartment houses, but one big apartment house that was created out of numbers 7 through 13, Washington Square North. And in order to do that, they had to raise the attic story a little bit, sufficiently to create a full extra floor. And they were able to do that in a way that might not today pass muster with the Landmarks Preservation Commission, but for its time was really pretty subtle. And the houses were preserved. And unless you're the kind of person, like me, who mourns the loss of any rooftop balustrade, you probably don't even notice the changes that were made when these houses were converted to apartments. Of course, it's a very sad thing that the interiors were gutted, but, you know, interior landmarking is still a very rare thing. The exteriors are preserved. They still read as individual houses, and we are still able to enjoy this wonderful row of houses. This is what the entrance to the apartment complex looks like. It was created in 1939 by the architects Scott and Prescott. This was, for 1939, incredibly enlightened design and plan. You didn't find anything better than this. This is the other side of Fifth Avenue. And as you can see in this photo, which is from 1922, it is from early 1922. And it was a photo taken of these houses right before they were redeveloped. These are sometimes called the Rhinelander houses. As I was just saying to Mosette, if you Google Rhinelander houses, you find that there are about 75 places in America that have something that they call the Rhinelander houses, which simply reminds us that the Rhinelanders owned an incredible amount of property in many different places. But these Rhinelander houses were on property that was not owned by Sailor's Snug Harbor. This was owned by the Rhinelanders. And the house right at the corner was built by William C. Rhinelander, a close relation of Edith Wharton, whose mother was a Rhinelander. And the last Rhinelander to live in this house, in fact, she lived in the house for 74 years, was Serena Rhinelander. She lived in the house at one time with her sister, Julia. It was the two of them who built the Church of the Holy Trinity on East 88th Street on Rhinelander property. Anyway, after Serena died, the Rhinelander family, which actually owned this house and the adjoining house and the brownstone, not red brick, but a brownstone right here, they decided to do what old New York property-owning families often did, and that is improve the property in such a way that they could make a little more money from it. But they did not, and this is a very important thing, this is what one of the houses, number 15, which was the home of the merchant gardener Howland, looked like originally. As you can see, a very beautiful house. Here we see in a 1921 picture. This is an undated postcard, actually, but I date it because 25 Fifth Avenue was built in 1921, and these three houses are clearly as yet unremodeled as they would soon be in 1922. So this is circa 1921-22. There they are again. I'm sorry, I just decided to include every picture of these houses I could find. And there aren't a lot of pictures, so I just, thought I would show off my ability to find pictures. This is how the houses were redeveloped. So let's just go back here. This is what they looked like when they were houses. They weren't torn down. They were renovated into an apartment building, kind of like what was later done on the other side of Fifth Avenue, but not as subtly. So what do we mean when we say they weren't torn down? It looks like they were altogether replaced. In fact, this apartment building, known as the Rhinelander Apartments, retains a significant amount of the original fabric of the row houses. Obviously not the brownstone, which was completely refaced in red brick so that it would, so that it would blend in with the other two, but the original brick, the stone sills and lintels and so on were retained, and even the columns from this house were retained and moved to the central location on the sidewalk, framing the front entrance to the Rhinelander apartments. So it was a significant change, and again, not the sort of thing the Landmarks Preservation Commission would allow, too significant a change. And for most of us in this room tonight, it's something that, would sadden us if it were to take place today. But it was far from the worst sort of thing that was done in 1922. And the architects who did it, Meineke and Frank, were actually really good at this sort of thing. The Rhinelander houses became the Rhinelander apartments, and there were also two other houses going west. This is a photo from 1928 showing the apartment building right there. And then, here's what happened. A developer named Joseph Siegel, who had built 1 Fifth Avenue. And by the way, just for your amusement, I thought I would read very quickly this wonderful passage that was in the New Republic magazine, October 12, 1927. It was written by the great and famous literary critic Edmund Wilson. And it's about Washington Square. The big red houses of the north and west sides had already been gutted of their grandeurs and crammed with economized cells. The cubbyholes of modern apartments and the city-peeling fronts of the south side, with their air of romance and mystery, had already been replaced by fresh arty grays and pinks, and now in the short months of summer, he's returned to New York after being away for the summer. This is 27. There have been erected on Lower Fifth Avenue 2 monstrous apartment houses, one just south of the Brevoort Hotel, that's 1 Fifth Avenue, and the other between 10th and 11th Streets, that's 35 Fifth Avenue, 15 stories. They loom over the village like mountains, and they have already changed its proportions. Their effect is to crush in the Washington Arch and in the row of red facades behind it whatever these had formerly kept of chaste elegance and decorous pride. The whole village seems now merely a base for these cubic apartment buildings. Such good quality as still lingered here along with the low roofs of the provincial town has thus far been rendered insignificant. It is impossible to get away from these huge, coarse, and swollen mounds, blunt, clumsy, bleaching the sunlight with their dismal, pale yellow sides and stamping down both the old formal square and newer bohemian refuge. Anyone here live in 1 Fifth Avenue? do you think of it as a coarse, swollen mound? Anyway, the thing is that Edmund Wilson didn't know from coarse, swollen mounds until Joseph Siegel got it into his head that having built 1 Fifth Avenue, he would add 2 Fifth Avenue. It was some years later. 1 Fifth Avenue was completed in 1929. 2 Fifth Avenue was conceived in the 1930s by a developer named Abraham Lefcourt, and he was going to build it, buy all the Rhinelander properties, knock them down, have Walker and Gillette design a high-rise apartment building. But then the Great Depression happened, and then Abraham Lefcourt killed himself, and that was the solution to that. But then Joseph Siegel got in on the act, and he came in with his architects, originally Sugarman and Berger, who had worked on 1 Fifth Avenue, and then later Sylvain Bien. And he was going to put up this monstrously huge apartment building that was going to actually not only replace all the Rhinelander properties, but it was going to go up to the sidewalk line with a sheer rise, which the zoning actually permitted at the time. He, in fact, tore down two of the houses before, again, long story short, Siegel ended up handing off the project to a different developer named Samuel Rudin, and it was Rudin who ultimately built 2 Fifth Avenue. But something about 2 Fifth Avenue, that this house was also torn down, the John Taylor Johnston house was torn down for 2 Fifth Avenue. But something you all know about 2 Fifth Avenue is that the way it is designed is very unusual for New York. That is to say that the high tower of 2 Fifth Avenue, which was ultimately designed by Emery Roth and Sons, is set back from the square. And right on the square, the apartment building has a totally different appearance. It's low rise, it's faced in red brick, not the sort of gray brick of the high tower. And obviously, it was meant to be, quote unquote, contextual. Now, this is 1950, and again, it was the Municipal Art Society that got in on the act. What they did was they went to Rudin, in particular, an MAS grandee of the time, a famous architect named Harvey Wiley Corbett, went and talked to Rudin and convinced him that this would be the thing to do, to build a contextual front along Washington Square North, something that would blend in with the old houses. The problem with this, and the thing that just sort of unnerves preservation-minded New Yorkers, is why couldn't they have preserved what was already there and incorporated it into the... This is doing things the long way round. They tore them down and then came up with this solution. This is the sort of thing that happened over and over and over again in New York, in Greenwich Village and elsewhere in New York before there was a landmarks law in 1965. It was nutty. Every time something was endangered, it turned into a 3-ring circus. And this was done. Now, when these were created, you know, Harvey Wiley Corbett thought this was a brilliant solution. Of course, he thought of it. So he thought it was a brilliant solution. The actual designer of this part of the building was Julian Roth of Emery Roth and Sons. He was one of the sons of, Emery Roth, who designed Majestic and the Normandy. Anyway, Corbett thought it was great, but a lot of other people looked at it and just, Albert Barr thought it was dreadful. Of course, he would have much preferred that the Rhinelander apartments had been preserved and incorporated into 2 Fifth Avenue, but they weren't. In the late 70s, when Paul Goldberger, the architecture critic, wrote his book about New York called The City Observed, he actually said he thought this was pretty good. He said that, you got to realize it's 1950. I mean, this was about the best you were going to get in 1950. I still think the best you could have gotten would have been to have preserved the Rhinelander apartments and incorporate them into 2 Fifth Avenue, but things were happening too fast. They were demolished. Anyway, this is what we got. This is what we have. And I suppose it could have been worse, but that's the whole thing, is that before the landmarks law, you had to settle for it could have been worse. And I just want to finish up with I found 3 photos that show the view looking north through the Washington Arch. And there you can see, if you look very closely, there are the original houses before they were redeveloped into the Rhinelander apartments. This is a view that shows the houses after they've been developed into the Rhinelander apartments. And remember, the apartment building retains a lot of the house's fabric. And this is what it looks like today. There's the vast bulk of 2 Fifth Avenue. And I don't mean to be dissing 2 Fifth Avenue. If anyone here lives there, people who live in 2 Fifth Avenue are proud villagers and happy to live there, at least until the special assessment times come around. But there you see the low portion of 2 Fifth Avenue along Washington Square North. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Francis. And finally, we have Susan DeVries.
Thank you. Yeah, there should be one slide before this. So I will hopefully try to bring all of these things together. We'll see. I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the people and the organization. So people that would have, as Lizette talked about, would have been living in the village, groups they would have formed that would have been fighting issues that Francis spoke about, and then kind of maybe duplicating a little bit about what Andrew talked about to kind of bring us back for our discussion. And this is just a list of names that has a slightly funny origin. I don't remember the exact date, but it was sometime in the early 90s. When I was working for GVHD50, we got together a group of preservationists who were busy in the 50s and 60s fighting to save the village, working on issues like Jefferson Market, Save the Village, zoning issues, and it was a group of preservationists that got together and gossiped and came up with a list of names, many names that we didn't know of. Some names, survive. Some stories, the story of Jane Jacobs, the story of maybe Ruth Wittenberg, those stories survive, but there are a lot of other people that were on the ground starting, in the 1930s and forward that were active in the preservation movement in the village. So these are just some of the names. And the village is a place, maybe not unusual in New York, but a place that loves a committee and an organization and a catchy name and a slogan. And there are way too many of them to go into all of them. And I think we've all kind of have mentioned some of them. But starting, all the way back in 1906 with the Washington Square Association, and moving forward on issues, Committee for the Washington Square Living Arts Center, a short-lived one, Committee to Save the Clock, we've talked about Save the Village, Association of Village Homeowners in 1961, a really important group as far as educating villagers about the importance of their house and how to take care of their house. And then I've got some pros and cons on here. One we'll talk about was the Committee for Realistic Landmark Preservation, Inc., which is a bit of the bad guy in the story. And some of these organizations were, as we've discussed, about very specific battles, or very specific places. And Washington Square Park, as we have seen, was one that there were a lot of battles about, starting in the 30s and the back map plan of Robert Moses, and moving forward to the various trying to save Rhinelander Houses, trying to save the House of Genius, the various Washington Square Park committees, and then the Joint Emergency Committee to close Washington Square Park to traffic, which is, I think, the longest name that we've got. And then all of us have talked about Jefferson Market, which is just an important one to know about because it's still a great example for us today. It's about starting with one thing, starting with trying to save that clock, which Margot Gale talks about in her oral history about, it was a Christmas party, and they could see the clock from the party, and they decided, how can we do this? They sent a telegram to the mayor. And it kind of started in that way, just that one thing, try to save the clock, which led to try to save the building, which led to try to get a library in the building, which led to let's get a garden around the building. So all these kind of incremental things. And the thing about all of these committees is the same people appear over and over again. There were a wealth of people in the village who were passionate about different things, but they all seem to serve on a million different committees. They all overlapped. And villagers, of course, are very good. We're very good at this time period about making a scene. We were chatting earlier about things that could happen in commemoration of the 50th anniversary. You might want to consider walking a pig again. That was an infamous protest, a pig at City Hall. There's some Greenwich villagers with Save the Village, had a little trolley that they took to City Hall to save the village. There were lots of little flyers and handouts. There were bake sales. There were endless kind of awareness campaigns. And I forget who it was. It was maybe Verna Small or Margaret Gale talks about, I think it was with Jefferson Market Courthouse, just asking people through the villager, send in $1, invest in this building, help us save the clock. And just little efforts like that, they were really smart about marketing. I think it was Verna who also mentioned that they knew enough in the 1950s and 60s that the women were kind of the powers behind, but they made sure to have some male chairmen to do the schmoozing necessary on a certain level. But the villagers, with all of that going on, fighting the individual battles in the village, they were very aware of what was going on at the national level. Already in 1947, and this is about a battle in Washington Square Park, but already in 1947, the people in the park that are trying to protect the park are talking about legislation. So they're already looking to what is happening elsewhere, because New York was not first in this case. We did not have the first landmarks law. So villagers in the 1940s were looking at what was happening in New Orleans, what was happening in Charleston, what was happening in other places, and why can't we do that here in New York? And as has been mentioned, the BARD Act in 1956 was necessary. It provided the enabling legislation so that we could actually have a landmarks law in New York, and the villagers were inviting Albert Bard to the village to talk to them. How can we use this law? And this is, again, in 59, so this is well before the district. It is while people are talking about the importance of designation, about protection, and the villagers are right there kind of having these conversations, wanting to be part of this dialogue. And it all leads up, of course, to the 65. This is that initial district that was recommended, and it wasn't a magical, here is a district. In 65, there was research that was done starting from 1962 forward. I think there were at least 14 volumes of research just on the village. So buildings, individual buildings that needed to be investigated, work that needed to be done to identify exactly what would be designated. And then, as Andrew mentioned, the shock of the cut up. And this was a shock. The newspapers, both the Villager and the New York Times, talked to local advocates, and they were shocked to suddenly find in November of 1966 that suddenly their lovely large district had been cut up. Some called it a jigsaw. Some called it raisins in the pudding. There were lots of kind of evocative names for it. But pretty much everyone was appalled, except for that group that I mentioned before, the Committee for Realistic Landmarks Preservation, which was basically a group of realtors and lawyers, not all of them in the village, but who were fighting the larger district, saying it would be a legal quandary, that owners would not be able to make any alterations on the inside of their buildings. It would be the death knell of real estate in the village if there was a historic district. So immediately, kind of in November of 1966, these 18 separate little districts were proposed. Within a few weeks, members of the Greenwich Village advocacy community created the Greenwich Village Historic District Council, yet another group that was basically an assemblage of all the other groups. So you had representatives from all the other major groups that said we're coming together and we are creating this council because we want a historic district and we want the one large historic district. And they did the same letter writing campaign that the folks who were against the historic district did. They pounded the pavement, they went up to the doors, they took surveys, they got people to testify that they were in support of the district. And then I think it was a Villager article, because the Villager was really great about covering all of this, all of the battle, mentioned at one hearing that the committee against said, we're going to sue if this goes through. And so the Greenwich Village Historic District Council said, we will also sue if it does not go through. So everyone was kind of threatening, and they kept marching forward, and we'll kind of be talking about the results, but I just wanted to leave this little quote from Verna Small, who was instrumental in this battle, when she was asked, well, what did the council do? How did you get this done? And that was her response. So that's what I'm doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And actually, that is a sort of a perfect way of kind of bringing it back and opening it up for the discussion that we're going to have amongst ourselves first, and then with you. So I want to present a question to the panel. And so let me just ask you this sort of very broad and open-ended question, whoever wants to kind of jump in. What was and is the significance of the Greenwich Village Historic District?
It was early, it was an attempt to put a positive face on the concept of landmarking and to preserve a group of buildings that were pretty safe to be rebuilt because there were people who were going to be able to do it, and that's just what happened. But it gives a win-win look to the Landmark Commission in their early days. They were very afraid of having the law go out with the baby in the bathwater. They were very afraid of doing anything controversial. You all will know that it is at this time the number of important buildings that went down just as the Landmark Commission is starting. It's pretty horrifying. How did Leonard Jerome's house go down? How did the old Opera House? It wasn't actually that much? And they took it anyway?
No, it was a hardship clause.
Well, it's, I didn't know that. They still should be. That should have been saved in Opera, which almost made it, but it was, what was it, Governor Rockefeller even backed saving the Metropolitan Opera, but the opera company was afraid that in the old building, wandering European opera companies would upstage the work that's going to go on at Lincoln Center, so they wanted it down. So I think that's it.
I think it goes to what Andrew was saying when he spoke about the early historic districts, with the exception of Brooklyn Heights, the tiny ones, Sniffen Court and Dougal Sullivan Gardens, those were all very sort of cohesive, homogeneous, little districts. What was significant about Greenwich Village was that it was big, it was sprawling, it was so incredibly diverse. It was a little bit of everything. There were tenements in the Greenwich Village Historic District, and those were, it was probably the first historic district that had tenements in it. That, I think, was a very significant thing, very significant in terms of sort of the way it shaped the preservation mentality going forward from that point. Also, very significant about Greenwich Village is that the only comparably big historic district before it was Brooklyn Heights. Brooklyn Heights never had a historic district designation report written for it. I think because it was the first, they didn't know they had to do that. And it's still, so it never got done, whereas Greenwich Village got the first really great report. And let me tell you, it's a great report. The reports today are great too, and arguably today, the quality of the research in the reports is superior. But for, I think, legal reasons, the reports today aren't meant to be read. Whereas the Greenwich Village Historic District report is something you can actually read from beginning to end, like you would a novel. It works that way, and it's wonderful. It's well written, it's not repetitive, it's great. But it was the first really big, meaty historic district report, and that was a significant thing.
I just wanted to add that there's also a lot of great commentary in the Historic District Report about modern buildings. That can be a little humorous to read. But yeah, I would just add to say that if they hadn't got the one large district, if it had stuck with the 18 small districts, I wonder how long it would have taken the commission to designate a larger district anywhere else. Again, really having it at that point, which is fairly early on in the commission's history, I think is important.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the sort of the history of districts that are designated, while Brooklyn Heights is larger, again, it has these kind of discrete, clear boundaries to it. Greenwich Village was really the first time that they grappled with where does it begin, where does it end? Is it okay to include things that aren't necessarily exactly what you sort of envision the historic district being, but are kind of part of it? If there hadn't been a Greenwich Village Historic District, there would have never been an Upper West Side Historic District, an Upper East Side, a Jackson Heights, you know, sort of many others. It's interesting you mentioned, Francis, the tenements being in there. They are in there, but if you read the designation report, they're not necessarily so thrilled that they're in there. And that's one, and you know, fortunately, I think our view of things like tenements have changed. But what was great about it was that they were willing to draw boundaries that included buildings that they didn't necessarily think that every building was a great building, but it was part of a greater whole. And that was definitely really the first time I think you saw that with a district. Here's a different question I'm going to sort of pose to the panel. If somehow in 2019 the Greenwich Village Historic District were being considered now, if somehow that neighborhood survived to this day, but without being landmarking and that were being considered now, what do you think would happen now? How would that district be considered today by the Landmarks Preservation Commission and with all the forces at work in our city today as compared to 1969?
That's very tricky because we can't know what the district would look like today, right?
Assuming it looked basically as it does now. So the existing district, if somehow it survived
magically, so we're not talking compared to the Lower East Side, we're not talking.
Do you think today the commission would consider a rambling district like that with sort of the good and the bad all mixed in? Would they be more inclusive? Would they be less inclusive?
I think so I don't kind of want to, you know, that's a bad, depends on whose property is in there. It depends on whose lawyer represents the real estate interests in there. I know, and the other thing that's missing in this story, where is Ruth Wittenberg? Where is Verna Small? We don't have the protests anymore. Part of the reason that this happened is we had people going out there and marching, in short of you and Landmark West, which do very vigorous campaigns. We're not behind the people. In the 50s and 60s, Margot Gale had a column regularly in the Daily News called New York Then and Now. Boy, could we use that. And it kept, you know, we've forgotten this. Chris Gray, who may have had another purpose behind some streetscape columns, but it did bring that sort of information. You know, I got the real estate section every Sunday just to see Chris. We have no such vehicle. And although I don't know if you all do, Landmark West sends teachers to school to try to, we just lost it. If you say a building is worth saving in England, the public's behind you. If you say a building is worth saving in New York, they say no, let the developer make us. I mean, we've kind of lost, I'm afraid, our love of all buildings. And what we need to do is be on New York One beyond making videos. We need to bring preservation and the joy of having a city that doesn't look like Dallas to large numbers of people, and we can't do it the easy way.
So here's another question. So I'm curious what each of you might think were the biggest challenges facing Greenwich Village in terms of getting a district designated, as well as what were the greatest assets that the neighborhood or the effort had, whether it was the sort of the people, the type of architecture, you know, sort of what was in the air at the time. What do you think was both most strongly working for and against the designation of that district?
I didn't know that who you were talking about. So, but to me, this was not a red hot district. So the ease was not being able to.
Please use the microphone.
Oh, sure. I think, do you remember the word that used to strike absolute terror into people's hearts when a building was owned by a company that hired Sandy Lindenbaum? He was the most fierce defender of the rights of landlords. I would not be particularly, I worry that we wouldn't have the people there, and I worry that the real estate community, if they were aware of the potential to do what they've done in the West Village here, we would have lost this.
There were, and I think that it really does need to be stressed that before the designation of the Greenwich Village Historic District, there were many, many significant losses. And you know, this was the case in Brooklyn Heights as well. Those losses would have just continued. When we think of Greenwich Village today, most of us, I mean, 1969, it's 50 years ago. Even the oldest among us were young when that happened. And so we don't really remember the village before all the 1950s apartment buildings, the 1960s, and 69, all the 60s apartment buildings were built. Think of some of the monstrosities that exist in parts of the village. Think of, again, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth because you might live in that building, but there are things like Georgetown Plaza, right? I mean, I don't know if anybody loves that building. I don't think so. But but that's an example of the sort of thing that would have continued unchecked in the village. I mean, we're talking about 35-story buildings, you know, with big plazas around them, and so on. Things that are rather unvillagey. But beyond that, there are also countless buildings. Think about what replaced the Hotel Lafayette. It's a nice building, actually, but the fact is that one of the most historic buildings in the village, the Hotel and Cafe Lafayette on University Place, was demolished. Think of the Brevard Hotel and the gigantic apartment building. That's 200 by 200 feet. That building has as big a footprint as the Dakota. And replaced the historic, really historic Hotel Brevard. I mean, that had a history going back to the 1840s. And that was lost. There were just, you could make a list of 200 such losses in the village just in the couple of decades before the historic district designation.
I think to go to kind of what the village had maybe going for it, despite the losses, is it did have a lot of politically savvy people who really kind of knew, despite those losses, to kind of work their local angles and get to the mayor, to work the protests that Mosette was talking about. They didn't win every battle, but they were figuring out with each loss kind of how they needed to organize to get to the next step, I think.
Actually, something funny. Martha Gale lived in a small row house opposite the clock tower. That's how she saw it. And she was forced to move to the Upper East Side because they tore her building down. So, irregularities, there you are. So, it did happen.
If you look at or listen to some of the oral histories on our website, or just any other source, primary source about the folks who were involved in these battles, they were thinking about the politics a lot. There's a lot of discussion about Carmine DeSapio, the Village Independent Democrats, Carol Breitzer, Ed Koch, when he was just a local councilman, how to sort of kind of leverage these things, how to activate the mothers with the strollers. There really was a lot of thought about that. I had to mention, because Francis made reference to the gigantic Brevoort East. The irony is, the Brevoort East is in the Greenwich Village Historic District. Further up University Place, those beautiful 1920s apartment buildings where the Albert Hotel are not in the Greenwich Village Historic District. So there were some very funny decisions made. And the last thing I'm just going to say before we turn it over to the audience is one of the things I also read in some of these accounts, which was interesting, one of the impetuses for the push for the historic district was actually, ironically, the victory in 1961 to get the rezoning. Anytime you have a rezoning, the developers are going to rush to get stuff in before the new zoning rules take effect. So there was a huge building boom in the neighborhood in 1960, 1961, where a lot of stuff was lost and a lot of awful new stuff went up. And that really pushed folks in the 1960s to try to get the historic district designated, because there had been this giant wave at the beginning of that decade.